Well, welcome everyone. I see some people are still joining, but we will get started with the preliminaries. So we're very excited for this new edition of the virtual seminar on climate economics organized by CEPR and with the organizing committee of Lind Barrage, Frances Moore, Glenn Rodebush, and myself, Mar Rawan. Today, we're very excited to have Lily Hsueh, who's joining us from Arizona State University. So Lily, I didn't put much attention when I was reviewing your CV, but we discovered she worked at the San Francisco Fed, which is very excited and overlapped with some of our panelists. Got her PhD at the University of Washington and is now a professor at Arizona State University. She works on public policy with a focus on environmental topics and has quite a varied agenda. Including marine regulations as well as toxic release regulations, as well as obviously climate. Today we will hear about her book, Corporations, and now I'm blanking, Corporation at Climate Crossroads, a very exciting book that is available online from MIT Press, and that basically examines how corporations think about the supply and the demand for mitigation and climate services provisions. She will, I think, overview the book for us and then cover one of the chapters in more detail. Very exciting. I'm very excited to hear about it. In terms of housekeeping, we will allow Lily to talk for about 15 minutes. If somebody has some pressing questions, please type them in, again, clarifying questions, and then keep your broader questions for Lily at the end. As a reminder, for those of you who have not attended, we will record the presentation, but we will remove the recording for the questions so that we can have a lively discussion. Any question's good. Perfect, Lily. So I'll let you start. Thank you for joining us again. I'm very excited about your presentation.
Thank you so much, Mar. Well, I'm Lily Hsueh and Associate Professor of Public Policy and Economics at ASU. As Mar said, I spent the first few years of my career at the SF Fed. So I'm really delighted to be able to present my climate economics and policy research as part of the virtual seminar on climate economics and now hosted by CEPR. So this research, as Mar said, is part of a larger book project with the same title that will be published later this year at MIT Press. So what my book does is that it follows the largest corporations by market capitalization and revenue between 2011 and 2020 to tell a larger political economic story based on rigorous statistical analysis, but also with some illustrative case studies of the top-down and bottom-up drivers of corporate environmentalism on climate change. And today I'm going to focus on Chapter 7, which is highlighted here, really linking corporate climate action with carbon footprints. Do outputs actually translate to outcomes? 2023, and then again in 2024, was the hottest year on record, as you know, and it was between 1.2 to 1.3 degrees Celsius above the 20th century average baseline, as shown in this figure. The y-axis is the difference between the 1901 and 2000 average temperatures, and the black bars indicate cooler than average years. Gray bars show the warmer than average years. As we know, the 2015 Paris Agreement stated long-term goal was to maintain global temperatures to well below 2.5%, with a target of 1.5 degrees, not percent, but Celsius, with a global target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that was what was conceived to avoid the worst impact of global warming and as a way to minimize the risk and costs of reaching even higher warming levels. Much of this warming is attributed to fossil fuel burning. The share of global carbon emissions due to fossil fuel burning have grown over time, as you see in this figure, and it's now responsible for about 90% of fossil fuels, or 90% of it is due to fossil fuels. And as we see here, coal, oil, gas, and other fossil fuels have far stripped land use related changes. And what we know is that, in fact, global firms, these are multinationals, represent about 70% of annual industrial emissions. And a majority of the emissions are emitted by about 100 largest companies in the world, producers of fossil fuels and cement. Corporate leaders such as Bill Gates and others, and Bill Gates himself, intended to do something about it. So in 2015, he founded the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, and where the objective was to invest in climate tech and focus on green electricity generation, storage, transportation, and energy system efficiency. Well, the inaugural 10 firms, their commitment are estimated to reduce about 800 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or about 2% of global emissions. That's, considerable. Well, you can say, well, these are corporate participants, firms with large pockets, deep pockets, and extra cash. Well, what's interesting is that we know that global firms, even with timid profits, have also made pledges. They've installed senior leaders and executives dedicated to climate mitigation. They have set an internal price on carbon. They've made voluntary climate disclosures and done quite a bit of ESG, environmental, social, and governance reporting, and in some cases with results. So as a motivation, here I'm showing quarterly profits of Microsoft versus Intel. Here you can see the quarterly profits between 2010 and 2024. Intel's typical growth between 2016 and 2020, Intel's carbon intensity, so this is entity-wide emissions per $1 million, held steady. As you can see in this figure by the dotted line, the solid line represents Intel's aggregate entity carbon emissions. So even while this global firm's total emissions grew, the company's profits improved and it increased in size, the carbon intensity held steady. So this is one example, and there are many, where corporate financial prowess or market power alone is unlikely to fully explain Intel's or firms' substantive climate mitigation. And Intel, in particular, has been ranked among one of the top 100 list of most sustainable firms. And it has been an early mover on climate action, leveraging the company's prior green chemistry initiatives, and has there's been many firm level carbon management initiatives. And one was one of the first in 1994 to report ESG-like indicators. It has participated in climate disclosures, has set an emissions target, and also adopted internal carbon price. And indeed, it has proactively and preemptively engaged with domestic regulation, whether it's in the US, in small countries like Costa Rica to India, and as part of the Green Deal for Europe, and has really focused on water use efficiency, and also an active participant in global governance. So the question that my book answers is, what firm level political economic factors drive corporate environmental behavior, but also performance on climate change? And today's talk is going to be focused specifically at looking at Chapter 7, where I make that connection between sustainability outputs and outcomes. Do firms that participate in proactive climate action, and in this particular case, voluntary climate disclosure, in the US case, emit less carbon emissions? Before turning my attention to linking outputs and outcomes, let me say just a few words about the multi-level political economics of corporate environmentalism framework that I introduced in my book. So I take as a starting point an inverted nested structure of institutions of Elinor Ostrom's, where global governance is at the top of the structure. Then we have regulatory governance, and then at the bottom, corporate governance. And this is where managers, managerial agency, firm level structures, and characteristics sit at this operational level. Well, I argue in my book that the rubber meets the road when the corporate level governance, particularly through managerial agency, interact with domestic regulation and global governance. And Chapter 7 in particular is concerned with one of these interactions, so the interactions between firm and regulation in the US case. What I do in this book, and some of that framework and context will be in Chapter 7 as well, is I do a synthesis of economics, political science, and management, where I'm really looking at articulating between the top-down and bottom-up drivers, where oftentimes political scientists and political economists are really concerned with more top-down approaches, and economics and management are more concerned with bottom-up approaches. But I'm saying, in fact, if for this problem solving, to solve the problem of climate change governance, we really need to bring it together. And managerial agency or preferences and their interactions with the regulation and global governance risks is what then together is a through line to which then we have companies engaging in corporate climate action. Just a quick preview, in Chapter 7, I do a panel data analysis of the S&P 500 firms' climate disclosures. I link that with carbon emissions, and I exploit the US EPA's Clean Power Plan, which at the time came it was viewed as something that was unique and of regulatory pressure when a lot of legislative policies have failed in Congress. And so I use that as exogenous policy shock. I will show you all the nuts and bolts of that. And then I do a quasi-experimental estimation where I have differences estimators, embed that in a discrete continuous modeling approach to account for both the extensive margins and intensive margins of effort, participation and effort in climate action. And a quick preview of the bottom line: carbon management without substantive mitigation increases entity-wide carbon emissions. That said, we've also found that basic transparency, so just response or just disclosure of climate information may in fact be linked to carbon emissions intensity reductions. And this, a lot of it is driven by regulatory pressure. So this preemptive behavior of greenhouse gas intensive firms, they participated and they even reduced their carbon emissions, regardless of whether they're in fact making substantive disclosures. So the rest of the talk will be focused on Chapter 7, as I said. So many of you have heard in the news that corporate climate disclosures are now increasingly becoming mandatory. A few years ago, I wrote a piece for The Conversation, which was picked up by PBS NewsHour, analyzing the potential impact of California's new corporate climate disclosure laws. California mandated that the world's largest companies to report their carbon emissions if they do business in California. But California is not the only place that has started these mandatory climate disclosure laws. You see them in the UK, EU, New Zealand, India, Singapore, and cities like Hong Kong. And so this suggests that policymakers and investors perceive climate disclosures as driving action to protect the environment. And whether that is true or not, whether it leads to performance or not, we will see. Well, as I alluded, companies have really been preparing for different forms of mandatory rules or climate policies, and they certainly have done so with disclosures. About 2/3 of companies listed on the S&P 500 index voluntarily report to the CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project. That was between 2011 and 2020, and by 2024, it was nearly 90%. CDP is a nonprofit based in London that has been around for over 20 years, and it surveys companies on behalf of institutional investors, whether it's on carbon management strategy, risk management, targets, other outputs, and also entity-wide carbon emissions. An important feature of the CDP, which I will exploit in my analysis, is that the CDP grades companies on different levels or different substantive levels of climate disclosures. They, for responding to the survey or basic carbon disclosure, companies can get a D grade, and they can get as high as a high grade as A or A plus if they are they're actually, conducting third-party audits of about 70% or more of their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So just a quick word about the various Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are direct greenhouse gas, or Scope 1 is direct greenhouse gas emissions that occur from sources that are controlled or owned by an organization, so direct emissions. Scope 2 is an indirect emissions associated with energy use, purchases of electricity from steam, heat, cooling, whatnot. And Scope 3 are the indirect emissions that come from the supply chain. A quick look at the empirical literature. Is there a link between carbon disclosure and carbon emissions? Well, what we know is that studies of mandatory programs have shown that yes, when firms and power plants respond to mandatory disclosures, there is a link to reduce emissions or reduce fossil fuel to clean fuel mixes. And in fact, in a 2021 study by Downer et al., when they looked at the UK's Climate or Companies Act of 2013, and looked at control firms versus publicly listed firms that are not subject to this mandatory rules, is that the UK listed firms that had to report their overall carbon emissions did reduce their carbon emissions by, I think it was about 7 to 8%. That said, voluntary carbon disclosures have had a bad rep. Various studies over the years have shown that it's either no impact or, in fact, there's been increases in carbon intensity. Well, I argue that these power sector studies have not accounted for the heterogeneity in firms' intensive margins. So, in fact, the substantive disclosures about their actual contents, and also the firm's extensive and intensive margins, in fact, matter. It's not a binary decision about participation, but it's also firms are deciding to how much effort they are in fact putting into making disclosures. So this study is actually inspired by a study in the business management literature by Delmas and Montesangos, where they an early study distinguished between different types of participants in a U.S. Department of Energy Climate Challenge program, where they showed that early joiners of the program faced higher political pressures and thus reduced their emissions intensities. So in this chapter, I model, it's in the same vein where I have different types of disclosures, and the disclosures is based on firms' level of disclosures or effort. Before I get into the kind of econometrics analysis, let me say a few words about the conceptual framework of this of my analysis. So I draw insights from the environmental economics and management and strategy and organizational behavior literature to build the case that a firm's decision to participate in CDP, voluntary carbon disclosure, and their substantive level of participation is really a function of the interaction between regulatory pressure and agency of corporate management through these executive level climate managers. What I say is that in the face of uncertainty, and global climate change is certainly a huge risk, managers and management perform three key tasks. They attract climate conscious employees, they align beliefs of employees with incentives inside the firm, they form governing coalitions comprised of really of stakeholders internally and externally, and they do so to align the values, learning, creativity, and innovation and of these various stakeholders. And of course, profits is part of that as well. But it is now an enlarged profit maximization where public and private politics, these are costly endeavors, are accounted for. In my book, I present illustrative case studies where, based on semi-structured interviews with executive leaders to understand these mechanisms. And how, you might ask, can managers get away from doing this? Well, Henderson and Van Dienstein contend that firms that adopt a corporate purpose, namely the aggregate sense of meaning and impact by employees of corporations, these are employees and workers who may accept lower wages when they derive identity and reputation benefits from working for the firm. And in fact, Kruger et al. In a 2022 working paper find that in Sweden, private sector workers earn close to 10% lower wages in firms that operate in more sustainable sectors. So this sustainable wage gap arises because workers, especially those in the higher skill level arenas and younger cohorts, value environmental sustainability and accept lower wages to work in more sustainable firms and sectors. So now let's add regulatory pressure. If regulatory pressure is high and the marginal cost of self-regulation is low, managers will now hasten their efforts. They will signal the firm's ability to internalize externalities, earn goodwill, and avoid liabilities. So we are seeing this preemptive behavior. Now, in terms of my empirical strategy, I have given you kind of a preview earlier. I am my data is a panel data set, and I follow S&P 500 firms. There were about 581 of them, first drawn from a 2011 to 2015 group of firms. I follow them through 2020. They come in and out based on mergers and acquisitions and also profitability. I get my carbon emissions data, and I focus on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions from the LSEG database. I have manager carbon management and carbon disclosure levels data from the CDP, and financials and market prices from Minto Global, Google Finance, and S&P Global. And my identification is really about interacting and bringing together regulatory pressure with the existence of managers responsible for climate mitigation in greenhouse gas intensive sectors. And I'll come back to that right away in the next slide. And again, I will also come back to my estimator, my diff and diff and diff estimator embedded in this discrete continuous modeling approach. So in this research, I make use of EPA's introduction of the Clean Power Plan. It was an executive order of the Obama administration, but beyond that, it was also part of the Clean Air Act under Section 111, Part D. So this, I argue, CPP is a plausible proxy or to be considered exogenous regulatory pressure because it was coming off the tail of more than a decade of failed legislative action. And I'm really using that to help link disclosure to emissions. Two events leading up to the CPP helped to boost its credibility. So in 2007, the Supreme Court decision enabled the EPA's protection to encompass greenhouse gas emissions. In 2009, EPA's science-based assessment showed that the greenhouse gases endangered public health. And then given that the CPP was really a performance-based standard specific to power plants, this means that it was likely to have these higher costs of compliance in an alternative policy, such as a carbon tax or carbon carbon cap and trade sorts of policies for any given level of aggregate base abatement. And so at that time, this end of other legislative options arguably opened the door for what political scientists called bureaucratic policy design. Which means this is policy established not by Congress, but by the EPA. These sorts of policies could potentially be more effective because they are not designed by legislators who may have incentives to respond to vested interests. And so for all these reasons, at that time, and so this is a retrospective study, CPP was viewed by corporations as a credible regulatory threat with consequential adjustment costs, which led firms in greenhouse gas emission intensive sectors beyond the power sector even to hedge against impending regulation in the paper study period. And we know, of course, there was been an influx of federal policies after the Paris Agreement. Obama joined, Trump exited, and Biden rejoined, and then now the U.S. have now exited the Paris Agreement, and we've had the Inflation Reduction Act and whatnot. There's been a lot of movements, but at that time, when there was no other options, the CPP was regarded by industry as something that signaled regulation to come. And of course, I have a lot of different statistical tests in this chapter and in this book to show that, in fact, the Clean Power Plan was an exogenous force. So here's the structure of my empirical model. So the endogenous binary model is a linear potential outcome model that allows for specific correlation structure between the unobservable that affects a firm's decision to participate in voluntary carbon disclosure, represented by TJ, and the unobserved that affects the potential outcome YJ, which is the entity-wide carbon emissions and stage 2. So there's a stage 1 and stage 2. And one such unobservable is regulatory pressure and other exogenous independent variables, which I include the triple difference estimators, the disclosure levels in the stage 2 of the outcome or the outcome stage of the model. And then I include year and sector and state fix effects. And the state fix effects, of course, will then help me to differentiate the variation of the red versus green states, for example. And so here I have kind of laying out kind of some of the math, the statistics. The decision to participate is made according to this rule, and where we have the kind of the error terms, or the error structure is a bivariate normal with mean 0 and covariate matrix looking this way, and it really, in sum, the average marginal effect and other parameters of this linear regression model is augmented by the endogenous binary participation variable, TJ. And the estimation is via maximum likelihood. So a very standard kind of modeling approach of this discrete continuous analysis. So I wanted to show the variables in my model explicitly and say a few things. So you see here the triple differences estimator. Clean Power Plan, or CPP, is turned on for 2014, 2015, 2016, and off for all other years. And so before and after the clean, that period of the Clean Power Plan when it was relevant. Manager, which is a binary variable and taken from the CDP survey, it's in fact serves as an exclusion restriction. It's part of the participation stage, but not in the stage 2 of the model. And let me before I say more about the exclusion restriction on the next slide, let me quickly say that the manager data is taken from the CDP's annual climate change questionnaire, and it answers the question, where is the highest level of direct responsibility for climate change within your organization? And companies can say that whether it's just an analyst or whether this managerial leader is part of the board of directors and at what levels. And it's coded as 1 or 0 otherwise if a firm houses this senior level manager. And I'll in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about how I deal with missing data and whatnot. But I want to also now turn to the exclusion restriction. And this is where I think the mixed methods that I've used in my book really has come to be really useful. So manager serves as an exclusion restriction. And I argue that explains the participation in CDP, but not directly linked to firm's decision about whether or not to reduce entity-wide carbon emissions. And this is because during this period of my study, the chief focus of these nascent offices of corporate sustainability was on outputs. It was very clear, the directors of these senior level folks, that their focus is really on these carbon management, sustainability outputs, emissions targets, whether to set an internal carbon price. They're not concerned about carbon emissions per se. That said, in my econometrics, I do have these statistical tests for exclusion restrictions, and it does come out to show that indeed we are able to reject our null of managers serving as exclusion restriction and the validity of that. So both kind of in terms of kind of the contextual rich context, as well as statistically, I see that manager serves as our exclusion restriction. I also want to now mention in the highlighted that here I include in my independent variables the CDP's various levels of disclosure by companies. And a feature of the EBV model is last year's participation also enters into the second stage equation. So a few quick words about these various levels of disclosures that and the CDP's grading of them. So points are allocated for each question on the CDP's climate survey. And at the end of the scoring, the number of points that a firm has been awarded at these various levels is divided by the maximum number that could be awarded either for transparency, whether they've actually responded to the survey. Regarding awareness, is the firm has it taken an initial assessment of business impacts and how that impact affects the ecosystem, whether the company have taken action and in fact adopted these various sorts of sustainability outputs, and then, or whether it's done even more than that, adopted internal carbon price and conducted third-party audits, and maybe even reported their scope 3 emissions. And so a minimum score of 75 is required to be assessed at the next level. And if this minimum score threshold is not achieved, then the company will not be scored at the next level. This means that each grade represents an additive effect. A higher grade implies that the lower grade and associated substantive level of climate action has been achieved. Okay. One thing to note, though, leadership is not environmental performance. Because CDP is all about sustainability outputs, it's just because you get a grade A does not mean that you are, in fact, reducing your carbon emissions or intensity by any means. Let's take a quick look at participation in CDP by firms. So there is a difference in participation level. We are seeing that non-greenhouse gas intensive companies, so these are more consumer-oriented sectors, they participate more. This kind of has panned out in the literature where greater consumer contact may in fact means more visibility. So they're taking action on these relatively inexpensive disclosure programs. At the same time, though, there has been more recent research that shows that greenhouse gas emission corporations will preempt regulation, both or private politics activism, and take it also participate as well. So there are these level differences, yet they are both going up and tracking each other, and we expect that this would continue over time. That said, what we actually see in the data is that non-greenhouse gas intensive firms increase their participation as more or less expected. And what may appear kind of maybe a bit non-intuitive is that greenhouse gas intensive companies, in fact, reduce their participation in the CDP in response to the Clean Power Plan. This appears non-intuitive, but there has actually been studies shown, Maxwell and Lyon have shown that participation in voluntary carbon disclosure, firms may not do it if there's no good news to share, and if there is this kind of preemptive behavior going on. And LD and Pfizer in a Jerry 2015 article find that energy-intensive manufacturing industries have more to lose to any kind of climate change mitigation policies or perceived regulations to come. There could be two effects: decrease in production or increases in net imports, and which will kind of translate to loss in competitiveness and then to less intensive industries. And what may happen is that the drop in competitiveness is more significant than that reduction in production. And so together, these studies suggest that no wonder when faced with regulatory pressure, greenhouse gas emission intensive companies may shy away from different voluntary carbon disclosures at the time of the CPP. Well, after 2016, as you see in that bar is where where the CPP was most kind of quote unquote perceived to be regulatory pressure, the greenhouse gas intensive companies are no longer experiencing the same kind of regulatory pressure from the CPP post 2016. And so we see this fluctuation in carbon disclosure rates for all firms. The main takeaway, though, is that after the CPP and the Paris Agreement, participation rates for greenhouse gas and non-greenhouse gas intensive firms track each other more or less similar to before the Clean Power Plan. Let's take a quick look at participation in CDP with manager versus no management or manager. Those with managers, what we see is that participation was at a pretty high rate in voluntary carbon disclosure in both a greenhouse gas intensive and non-intensive industries. And this suggests that variation in management factors, in fact, matter both directly on its own and indirectly through its interaction with regulatory pressure. That said, participation by greenhouse gas intensive sectors did decrease, which I showed earlier as well, while participation by non-greenhouse gas intensive sectors tended to increase post-CPP. This could be a harbinger, actually, for strategic action by participation in the more consumer-facing sectors, which we will find out in the results that I'll show soon, that they participated and did a lot of these sustainability outputs irrespective of their carbon footprints. Now for my empirical results. So I ran these EBV models for all the S&P 500 in the first column or the second column, and I have two split samples of greenhouse gas intensives and consumer-oriented firms. Three main results. The greenhouse gas intensives companies in general are just less likely to participate. And this was significant at a 3 or at the 10% significance level. Firms firms with dedicated climate change managers responsible for climate mitigation tend to participate more. And in the interesting result, which saw in the raw data, and our models confirms, is that consumer-oriented sectors after the CPP, those with managers participated more, even though they're not targets of the CPP, the Clean Power Plan. Of course, we know, though, that the momentum also was building at the time for the Paris Agreement. Now, onto my entity-wide carbon emissions, or the second stage of the EBV model. So what we see is that mere disclosure, so again, basic transparency or just response to the survey, is associated with reductions in entity-wide carbon emissions. Carbon management, though, without substantive mitigation, so these are at the CDP management level, they've had these sustainability outputs, whether it's targets, third-party audits, they claim, or they reported, well, it was linked to increases in carbon emissions. Let me just quickly show, and I'll show you results in pictures and in figures of the various sectors. So how do these results translate to elasticities? So in other words, what is the estimated percent change in carbon emissions in response to change in level of disclosure of climate change mitigation or climate change activity? For the S&P 500 companies as a whole, a 2% decrease in for the basic disclosures, or the grade D companies, essentially is canceled out by the 2% increase for the grade B companies. Of note, the confidence bands are wide, albeit they do not include zero. Now, for the greenhouse gas intensive firms, let's now look at the kind of sectoral heterogeneity. For the intensive firms, it turns out mere carbon transparency means that an estimated 5% decrease in carbon emissions. The confidence interval is between 2% to 7%. Zero is not part of the confidence interval, though. So there's maybe something materially true here. These firms, of course, are the targets of the CPP, or they're experiencing pressure from expected regulation, not yet but in the horizon at that time. And so there is evidence that greenhouse gas intensive firms that are, though, that maybe they're the already carbon efficient ones. They were the ones that used proactive disclosures to signal their climate leadership. And the consumer-facing firms now, we see that what we see is clearly kind of perverse results. Of course, these are not companies with a carbon intense. They're not carbon intensive, and their overall emissions are not that great. But what we do see is these, kind of greenwashing behavior of note. But one caveat, in which my public policy colleagues have shown, is that, well, perhaps there's positive catalytic spillovers. Well, there's learning by doing. Maybe they're practicing for the real thing, and these, for the mandatory policies to come. So, who is to say, there is perhaps a lot of these learning by doing, and that any of that kind of positive spillovers could outweigh any increases in carbon footprints, and especially these are not carbon intensive companies to begin with. And of course, though, these spillover effects are harder to measure quantitatively. The story is different for carbon emissions intensive, or carbon emissions intensity, So there's some mixed results. There's some evidence of greenwashing. So even for basic carbon transparency, those that are actively engaging all sorts of carbon management and commitments are associated with increases in carbon intensitivities. That said, for one measure of carbon emissions intensity, so this is per full-time employee for S&P 500 companies who are filing for these carbon disclosures, we're seeing this reduction. So what we're seeing is that as disclosing firms increase in size, it reduces its carbon emissions on a per employee basis. So this, this is good news. And we know these are companies are, some of them, many of, and they're kind of facing the regulatory pressure, right? Because this is looking at the pool data set here. And this is good news, but one thing I would mention is, according to climate scientists, what we want also is that the reduction in the aggregate carbon emissions, and so both needs to happen. Now, I want to say just a few words about my robustness checks. I have a bunch of them, whether it's different measures of firm size, or I'm looking at different standard errors clustered at different levels, at the state sector level. I have these various different sorts of interaction, fixed effects, sector and year, state and year, looking at different measures and of what it means to be a leader within CDP, inclusion of environmental innovation, which is a measure of production innovation, R&D, capital expenditure by firms. I fix managers are different times, and I also have run these alternative models as well. So these various different robustness checks actually really plan out with respect to signs and magnitudes. And I'll just quickly kind of here show you for the different cuts of the data. So here's the full kind of data. And then I also here have the just the split sample of greenhouse gas intensive firms. And then here's this split sample of the consumer-oriented firms. And I highlighted the results all of the results, and they seem to pan out with similar signs and magnitude. I'm happy to come back to any of this in the Q&A. So now I want to just say a few words of the bottom line and policy implications. So there's evidence of increases in total carbon emissions intensity, or carbon emissions, I should add, for the entire S&P 500 index firms. That shows that some of these companies instituted carbon management, sustainability outputs without, and notably those without these other kind of more stringent outputs like third-party audits. We're showing that there is some greenwashing potential greenwashing there. But I also show that firms' basic carbon transparency, however, was correlated or associated with reductions in carbon emissions intensity. And also facing regulatory pressure, greenhouse gas intensive sectors reduce their carbon emissions irrespective of substantive disclosures, meaning even just by responding to the CDP, we are seeing these reductions. And what I show in the book is that a lot of these greenhouse gas intensive firms, it's the carbon efficient firms that participated to signal their leadership. Ultimately, one big takeaway of this chapter, but also one part of the message of the book, is that proactive corporate climate action, these corporate environmentalism, these self-regulation activities and regimes and participation and effort really require credible regulatory pressures. They don't necessarily have to be command and control. They could be market-based, but there is that need for, whether it's pressure about regulations to come, the signals of regulations to come, policies, engagement with this private and public interaction. And a lot of times, I think firm level dynamics and regulation is under-examined, and that's where the book really, I think make a contribution. One word about this book is that it actually has been awarded by MIT Press of an open access edition, so everyone will have access to it. And so, have your libraries get the print editions, but please, feel free to download it from the MIT Press website. Later this year, will come out in the fall. Before I end, I just wanted to quickly just say a few words about what the book is about. Again, it examines the demand for and the supply of global businesses, climate mitigation, and a lot of these actions have been done proactively. And it's a statistical analysis with a large kind of database that I've compiled and put together myself, with attention to causal inference and illustrative case studies to look at some of the mechanisms. And the goal of it was really to look at that interplay between firms, public policy, and also even global governance, and controlling for and accounting for what's happening in the marketplace. Global businesses are free agents, and they are also products of their political, economic, and regulatory environments, including global governance. And so both agency and structure and mechanisms, all of these matter. And yeah, and so this is what my book is about. Thank you very much.
Very good, Lily. Thank you so much for the presentation. I will stop the recording now so that we can get into the Q&A.